Do you know, little child, what is in you? Can you dream, little child, of going far? Do you know, little child, of the power you've been given? Do you know, little child, whose you are? You were made in the image of God, just a little bit below the angels. And the masterpiece of heaven's hand is your body and your soul. You were made in the image, you were made in the image, you were made in the image of God, in the image of God. Do you see, child of God, who is in you? Do you see, child of God, where you belong? Do you see, child of God, Christ the Lord who dwells within you? Do you see, child of God, who makes you strong? You were made in the image of God, just a little bit below the angels. And the masterpiece of heaven's hand is your body and your soul. You were made in the image, you were made in the image, you were made in the image of God, in the image of God. Do you care, precious one, who is in you? Do you care, precious one, who's in your soul? Do you care, precious one, for the temple of the Spirit? Do you care, precious one, to behold? You were made in the image of God, just a little bit below the angels. And the masterpiece of heaven's hand is your body and your soul. You were made in the image, you were made in the image, you were made in the image of God, in the image of God.
Today, I want to talk with you about images, kind of the importance of them. Yesterday, did you go out and try to see that solar eclipse that was taking place? Where I live, we didn't get really a very good view of it, but yet, we tried all the different ways to be able to see that image. We tried the whole little pinhole in the cereal box so that we could see kind of this image inside this box that kind of reflects the sun itself. And that was pretty cool, and that was one way that we were able to see it pretty well. Although actually we kind of had a really cool experience because there were so many clouds that they were filtering out a lot of the rays of the sun, and we were actually able to see this solar eclipse in a reflection from the back of our vehicle. I mean, it was kind of amazing that we were looking at this image, and I'm sure people who were passing by was wondering why we were just so fascinated by the back of our vehicle, but we were watching the solar eclipse because we could see that reflection. And we knew that was an image of the sun, of what was really happening in the world around us. Well, today I want us to kind of think about reflecting the image of God and what that looks like. But we might start at kind of a little bit of a not so familiar place, at least whenever you're thinking about reflecting the image of God. We're going to start with a story from Jesus. Now that makes sense, but this story might not make sense at first, but let's dive in together. In Matthew chapter 22, there's a very interesting story where people are trying to trap Jesus. Yeah, I know. There's a bunch of stories like that, but this is one that they've actually got a pretty decent plan. Well, let's take a look at it. In Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 17, we read, "Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Yeah, okay. So the plans to trap Jesus right here, they include political questions. This very political question about, well, what about this imperial taxes? We don't like to pay taxes most of the time today, but I mean, they were having to pay taxes to somebody else. I mean, that would almost be kind of more similar to us if here in America, if we were still, like paying taxes to England or something like that. It was kind of an odd thing, and you sort of wonder, well, why do we do that? Why do we pay taxes to this other government that's actually in charge of us? And that's how it was with Rome. That's how it was with this imperial tax to Caesar. So this plan that was going to trap Jesus, it included this political question. Has this method ever been used today? Yeah, of course it has been. Well, we can learn something about this method and about this way that they were trying to trap Jesus by looking at how Jesus responds in this case. So let's keep reading in this story. As we continue in Matthew 22, verses 18 through 22, we read this. But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said to them, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, so they left him and went away. Now, it's kind of a very interesting passage, isn't it, right here? Because as you read this, you find out what his question comes down to. And I mean, it's a pretty good way of answering the question without exactly answering the question as much as what you would think, at least. They want a straightforward answer. They kind of get one, but in a roundabout way. The roundabout way has to do with looking at a coin that was used to pay for that tax. Now, interestingly enough, and I'll just point this out, isn't it interesting? They had one of those coins with them. I don't know exactly why. Don't know if they'd always carry one of those, but they get one of those coins because he asked, well, bring me one of those coins. The very coins you use to pay that tax, let's look at one of those coins. Then he asked them the question, whose image is this? Well, take a look at any one of our coins here. And in the United States, what we have here. Let me tilt it the right way. There we are. We have at least one of the different presidents that we have, very similar to how they put Caesar, okay? So they put Caesar on their coins, we put different presidents on ours, and depending on which coin it is, of course, it has a different president, and all of them have huge significance throughout history. But the question still comes back to, whose image is this? If you look at our coins, it's an image of a man, it's the one who is in charge, the president, okay? That was who was in charge there too. It was Caesar. And what Jesus said was, give back to Caesar what is Caesar. Or, as you probably remember it, is render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God. Whenever you look here and you think about giving back to Caesar the things that are Caesar, that's what we're doing whenever we pay taxes. We're giving back the very coins that already have their inscriptions on them, already have their images on them. But then as we look at this second thing, I want us to kind of spend a little bit more time on this. What about the second thing that he says right here? Because he at first says, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. Okay, so that makes sense. He's kind of really already answered the tax question. But now come back. What about the second part of how he answers? Because he's teaching more than just about taxes here. He says in verse 21, to give back to God what is God's. I want you to think about that. What is God's? I mean, what does God own? Well, let's also kind of specifically look at this question again. Think about the things that God owns. Well, whose image is this? Whose image do we see? And let me ask you another question. Whose image are you made in? Because I believe it's very significant to this. Now, this image of God shows up from very early on in the Bible. In fact, Genesis chapter 1, we get information about the image of God. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, we read, this is part of the creation week, by the way, and we read, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." When you look at this, you see God created mankind in his own image. Yes, that means man and woman. You look at this and you see male and female. Okay, yes, it's three different ways of saying the same thing, that God created mankind. Male and female, he created them in his own image. Doesn't matter if you're a man or if you're a woman, you are made in the image of God. So that question of, well, whose image is on that coin? Well, whose image is on you as a person? It's God himself. And whenever you look at what we, as this image bearer of God, are called to do, from the very first page of the Bible, in verse 28 of Genesis 1, we read what we are supposed to do. Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, and then rule over, it says, all these living creatures that move on the ground. When you look at it, we're called to fill, we're called to subdue, and we're called to rule over. Well, how have we done about that? How has mankind done? How have humans done about filling, subduing, and ruling over the earth? And if you want to get a little bit more, kind of relevant to us, how are we doing? How are you doing in this? Because we are called to do this. This is what it means to reflect this image of God. Because we have been made in the image of God. You have been made in the image of God. I have been made in the image of God. That means something. It means something significant to us. And this is not just something that we see in the Old Testament just kind of mentioned once. No, it's mentioned numerous times throughout the pages of the Bible. And even as we carry over into the New Testament as well, we see how significant this is for us. Let's turn to Romans chapter 12 together. Romans 12 verses 1 and 2. It reads, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." So right here in Romans 12, we get this call to offer our entire bodies. Remember, whose image is on that coin? Whose inscription is on that coin? So the next time you see a coin, be reminded of they bear the image of a man. But what about you? You as a person, whose image do you bear? Whose inscription do you bear? Well, you bear the image of God. You bear the word of God. His inscription is written on your heart, so to speak. And here we are called to offer our entire selves, our bodies, as a living sacrifice. That means a lot. This is the type of sacrifice that we are called to give. We are called to give everything. This is what it means to have this true and this proper worship before God. This is what's pleasing to God, is by giving our entire selves. Now, at first that seems very sacrificial, and it is. But God has not asked us to do something that he himself didn't do first. He gave his entire life. Look at Jesus. I'm not talking about just the end and how he died for us, though that's true. Back up and look from the very beginning how much Jesus was willing to sacrifice. He gave everything for you and for me so that we can have life. He offered up his entire life as a living sacrifice, and he has simply asked us to follow in his footsteps and offer up our lives now as a sacrifice to God. This is what it means to worship God, by being this image bearer, this reflector of what God has placed on us, what God does through us. And if we do this, we are also called not to be conformed to the pattern of this world. So don't fall into the schemes of this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of your mind, by the word of God that's working in us, so that we will know what God's will is, his perfect, pleasing, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Now, when we think about reflecting God's image, I want you to be aware we have the perfect example of that. That is Christ himself. To turn to another passage in the New Testament, let's look at the book of Colossians together. In Colossians chapter 1, we get this beautiful passage that speaks about the Son, Jesus Christ himself. And Paul there, he writes to the church in Colossae, and he says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and things on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. You look at this passage and you see this beautiful image of the Son. And the Son himself is called this image of the invisible God. So, sometimes we have a hard time about God because, he's spirit, and how do we really see him? How do we interact with him? And, sometimes the way that we talk about him is sort of a little distant. He is this invisible God whom we serve. But yet what we read about here is the Son is the image of the invisible God. If you want to see a perfect reflection of God, a perfect image of God, look at Jesus. That means go throughout the Gospels. Look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and see how they talk about how Jesus responds in the different scenarios he finds himself in. How does he respond whenever people want to attack him and plan against him? We already started with that. And you'll find out about this perfect reflection of God, this perfect image of God. All the while, remember, you, me, we together, we are called to reflect the image of God himself. That's amazing. And honestly, I think sometimes we as Christians, we need to realize just the significance of that statement, of what we've been called to do is to bear the image of God in our world so that people will be able to see him. Now, if you look at it, of course, we're not going to do it perfectly. We look at the Son and we see a perfect image of God there. Yes, we see the image of the invisible God. And we see that what he did, we learn from the sacrifice that he gave. We see at the end of this passage here in verse 20 that he was the one who was able to make peace through his blood that was shed on the cross. He makes peace for us. That's how we know peace. It's through that blood that he shed for us on the cross. That wonderful, beautiful power of the blood that Jesus shed for us. This is an amazing passage when we learn and are willing to learn from Jesus about what it means to reflect this image of God. So I ask you today, are you learning from God? Are you learning from Jesus what it means to bear this image? Make sure that you are living your life in such a way that you're not conformed to this world, but you are transformed. That's totally different, totally changed. And the way that we do that is following the way of Christ. Are you willing to go on that journey? It's gonna be a good one. It's also going to be one that's going to take the rest of your life. It's a commitment. But it's a commitment worth taking because it's the road that leads to the way of life. It's the only road that leads to life. And that's the road that follows Jesus. He's already done everything for us. He is the image of the invisible God. Let's make sure that we also, who bear that image, that we reflect the image of God in the world so that people might glorify our Heavenly Father and follow him.
May my hands be holy when I kneel in prayer. May my life be holy when I praise. Help me, Lord, respect the role you've given me. May I serve with honor all my days. May I serve with honor in the role you've given me. And may I never go beyond my place as I serve my Savior and I give you praise. Help me follow the truth and I'll be saved. May my hands be holy when I kneel in prayer. May my life be holy when I praise. Help me, Lord, respect the role you've given me. May I serve with honor all my days.